Hi everyone, our topic today is monasticism. Monasticism means people who live alone, living alone. But when we talk about it today, we're going to refer to institutions called monasteries, where people who wish to pursue a religious lifestyle live all together. We're also going to talk about the Christianization of Europe, not in terrific detail because it's a complicated process, but I want to talk a little bit about that too. Why we care about monasticism, right? So, for one thing, in all of these little kingdoms that have resulted from the breakup of the Western Roman Empire, there is a need to preserve some national and international unity. Monasteries provide that by keeping communication lines open between themselves and by persisting in speaking the language of the Roman Empire, which is Latin. Now, in this period that we're talking about now, the early Middle Ages, Latin begins to change from a single language into a multitude of other languages, which we call the Romance languages. Spanish, Italian, French are three examples. Monasticism also provides for moral authority. Wherever there is a monastery, there is also a testimonial of Christian authority, particularly the authority of the Pope of Rome. Institutionalized memory and literacy and linguistic skills are important because they show us how the institution of a monastery can provide historical context for us later on. And they also continue to be literate, which is something that most people in the early Middle Ages don't have access to, and speaking multiple languages, which is the same. I want to talk a little bit about preservation of unity, and I'm going to do that by talking about Ireland. Ireland had been Christianized in the 5th century by a saint called St. Patrick, who has a fantastic life of him written in the 7th century, which is full of exciting news, especially the myth that St. Patrick drove the snakes out of Ireland, if you're familiar with that story. The Irish, once they became Christian, did a great deal of missionary activity, and in fact, even though there were Christians in England, some of the missionary activity that went on at that time was actually coming from Ireland and converting people who lived in England and Scotland. And I have Iona. Iona is an important monastery there, founded in 597, which provides more impetus for missionary activity in the region. I want to say a little bit about the Synod of Whitby, which happened in 664 CE. It came to be found that the Irish Church, which had been cut off for a little while from the Roman Church, celebrated Easter a little bit differently than the Roman Church. They celebrated it on different weekends. And whereas that doesn't bother us in the 21st century, people can celebrate when they want to, it was very important to the church authorities in England and Ireland that they figure out exactly when Easter was supposed to be. And you may or may not be familiar with how we determine Easter in the Catholic and Protestant churches. It's the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring equinox. So that's why it moves all around the calendar. It actually is based on a lunar calendar, a moon calendar, rather than a sun calendar. The Synod of Whitby was called to figure out which of the two churches' calculations for Easter were going to be accepted. A synod is simply a meeting. Whitby was a place, a very large monastery, what's called a double monastery with monks and nuns in it, led by an abbess who was very powerful and educated. Her name was Hild. And she happened to be the sister of the local king, the king of Northumbria, whose name was Oswy, O-S-W-Y. So the story goes, there's a famous famous legend that goes with this moment at the Synod of Whitby. Hild and Oswy were supposed to be hearing arguments from each side of the question of who was going to get to determine when to celebrate Easter. The Irish arguer got up and told a story about St. Patrick, told about all the famous Christian characters that came out of Ireland, and basically said, well, we've been doing it this long, we're not going to stop now. But the Roman arguer had a different point of view, and he made the argument that the Roman Church took its idea of where Easter came from St. Peter, the first bishop of Rome. And Jesus had said at one point to St. Peter in the Bible, it's Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whosoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whosoever you shall loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." As you might remember, that verse was interpreted to mean that St. Peter stands at the pearly gates of heaven, and if he doesn't think that you are a good Christian, he won't let you in. Well, when the Roman arguer made that argument to King Oswy asked, "Are you telling me that if I go with the Irish side of this question, that I might not get into heaven?" And the Roman representative said, "That's right, you're not going to get into heaven because of that." And so Oswy decided on the side of the Roman Church, wanting to make sure that he got into heaven. Now, the niceties of that story are not as important for you to understand as it is important to understand that this is a phase in the preservation of unity of the church and unity of international bonds between the churches. Okay, moral authority. We're going to talk about St. Benedict of Nursia and his rule, and you're reading some of the rule for class. So I want to give you a little bit of an introduction to St. Benedict, who was born around 480 CE and died in about 547 CE. You see, he's very early in the early Middle Ages. He's famous for his rule, where he suggested that the people who chose to live in that monastery would take 4 vows. Poverty, meaning that they could not have any personal possessions of their own. Chastity means no sex ever. Obedience, complete obedience to their ecclesiastical superiors, including their abbot. The name of the leader of a Benedictine monastery is an abbot, A-B-B-O-T. And it's an abbess, A-B-B-E-S-S, for a women's monastery. Now, poverty, chastity, and obedience are the basic 3 vows that professional religious people took in the 6th century. Stability was the one that Benedict kind of invented for himself. Stability meaning that the monk or nun who took vows would stay in the monastery for the rest of their lives. For some people, particularly for women, the vow of stability meant going inside the walls of the monastery and never leaving again, except to be buried in the churchyard. So stability was a very big deal. What the Benedictine monk or nun was supposed to do is ora et labora, pray and work, prayer and work. So in order to pray, they went by a schedule that is known as the Divine Office. I'm going to play you some of their music that they use to remember the things that they're trying to remember. But basically, they memorize large portions of the Old Testament in order to be able to sing them during the religious services of the day. There were 8 services in the Divine Office. So you can see there on the bullet point, you'd be getting up in the middle of the night, depending on the season, around midnight or around 2 a.m., singing a religious service, going back to bed, getting up for dawn, lauds, singing a service at 6 a.m., 9 a.m., and noon, then at 3 p.m., and then at sunset, and then at Compline at 9 p.m. right before bed. Now, as you can imagine, this is a very punishing series of religious services, which are done 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's based on Psalm 119, which tells its reader to pray without ceasing. So what they took that to mean in St. Benedict's rule was that the monks would pray the entire book of Psalms weekly. And they do that, as I mentioned, by singing them. The song is called Gregorian chant, and we'll listen to some in class. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about literacy. Literacy is a rare thing in the early Middle Ages, less rare in the High Middle Ages, but never at any time during the period we're studying is there greater than about a 10% literacy rate. So for the most part, most people had no access to reading and writing. And certainly people who were enslaved on large manors and plantations, people who worked for a living, people who made things, generally did not read or write. Some of them could do simple mathematics, but they would have to do that in their head. So one of the things that a monk or a nun can do is to provide some memory and some literacy to a given geographic area. Right? So not only would monks and nuns pray and memorize the Bible in Latin, but they would also speak and read Latin. There is a word, salteratus, that means that you are sufficiently fluent in Latin that you can actually read the Psalms. Right? Now, over time, the demands of singing all those religious services and reading and speaking Latin for various things, early in the career of St. Benedict, he intended for his monks and nuns to work in the fields and then come back home to do the religious services and then to work for their bread out in the fields again. But the demands of that prayer schedule are so serious that gradually monks and nuns were divided into groups. The ones that did the praying were called choir monks and nuns. And then there were monks and nuns who were known as lay brothers and lay sisters, who actually did the heavy manual work of the monastery. It's a two-tier system. So the upper class ones generally became choir monks and nuns. Lower class people generally became lay sisters and lay brothers. As you may be aware, some monasteries made some of their money for their upkeep through copying and illuminating books. And there's a wonderful little picture down here at the bottom I just want to show you. All right, here is a monk. He has a piece of parchment in front of him, right, and he is writing on it. And you can kind of see he's sort of got a hood pulled up over his head. Right? And then he's hung the sheets of parchment that have been written on this rod over here on the wall to dry. And there's a woman over here, a nun, doing exactly the same thing. Some of the manuscripts that are produced by monasteries in the early Middle Ages are breathtakingly beautiful, covered with illumination, little illustrations, sometimes very funny or very beautiful. And then also they provide things like leases and rents for wealthy people. If wealthy people want to join a piece of land to another piece of land, for example, it's monks and nuns who do the writing for that. They also provide, to a certain extent, primary education for children. Monks and nuns are generally educated at very young ages in the monastery by the older monks and nuns. Now, nobody is sending their children just yet in the 6th century just to the monastery for school and then bringing them back out again. In large part, the children who are being educated in monasteries are being educated to become monks and nuns. Here's an example of one of the monastery produced illuminated manuscripts known as the Book of Kells, finished about the year 800 in Ireland. This is known as the insular style, meaning from the island. Right, so you can see up here there's some lion's heads up here with some interlace. This is referred to as Celtic interlace, comes right out of Ireland, and there's interlace in other places. And down here we've got this very interesting image, and you can take a minute if you like to try to figure out what exactly is going on here. The scene is actually Jesus being arrested in the garden at Gethsemane. So this is the point at which he's arrested and then is taken to Pontius Pilate to be condemned. As you probably have noticed, there is a great deal of difference in size between Jesus and the soldiers who are grabbing him. And that's because in medieval art, for the most part, the most important person in the picture is the largest, and the least important person is the smallest. So it's not done to scale. Jesus is clearly the important person in this picture. And the soldiers who are grabbing him are given, for some reason, bright red hair, which I find very entertaining. The other thing about insular work, about Irish work, is that it's usually divisible down the middle. It's perfectly bifurcated, so you could fold this image on itself and the halves would match up. Now here's a slightly different illuminated manuscript from a monastic context. And I want to draw your attention. This is the top is the scene of the manger. So Jesus is lying in the manger. You can see an ox and a donkey there with him. There's some angels hanging around in the margins, and Mary and Joseph are on either side. And then down at the very bottom is the Annunciation to the shepherds. So those are shepherds looking up. We have to assume looking up at the Star of Bethlehem, which I think is here, if you look closely at that. Now, if you look a little bit at that picture, and you look at the bright colors, and you look at the bright gold leaf, which is liberally splashed all over this piece of parchment, you know that you're looking at a very expensive and very fancy work. So we're going to talk more about some of those works in class. Now I want to show you, last of all, an image which is a plan of a large monastery. So once monasteries get to be very big, and this is in the 9th century, about 830 CE, monasteries are like their own little cities. They've got everything that anyone would need inside the walls, and they even have special buildings in which different things are done. So the monastic church is the biggest structure. That's it right here. Right? And you can see the altar back here behind a screen. Right? Next to the church is what's called the cloister. So there's a little walk here with a well in the middle. Here is the refectory. You might recognize that word from Baker Refectory, the place where the monks eat. Here's the dormitory, the place where the monks sleep. And there's some latrines off here, just in case anybody needs to go to the restroom. Over here we have a guest house where guests of the abbot can stay. Stables where you can take care of the horses. And there's all sorts of stuff over here. There's an infirmary where people who are ill can be treated. There's a blacksmithy where ironwork can be done. There's a butcher's, there's a place for the butchers. And here is a rather lovely herb garden with different kinds of medicinal plants. Okay, bring your questions to class about what it was like to be a monk or a nun. And I'll see you there.